Before we start, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I never thought I'd be the kind of man asking strangers for attention, but when you're carrying something that was never meant to be spoken aloud, you learn that silence only works when everyone agrees to keep it. I'm not sure that agreement still holds. My name is Thomas Holly. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, I worked in places that officially did not exist. I didn't wear a uniform with patches or medals you could recognize. I didn't give interviews. I didn't appear in photographs. My work fell under what people loosely call black operations, but even that term doesn't begin to cover the layers of secrecy involved. I operated under the authority of the Department of Defense, with oversight from agencies that never appeared on paper, and I followed orders that were classified above anything I'd been trained for. I'm not telling this story because I'm angry or because I want revenge. I'm telling it because I'm dying, and because the truth I've carried for decades has started to feel heavier than the consequences of speaking. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer has a way of clarifying priorities. The doctors don't use words like timeline anymore. They talk in probabilities. My wife passed 5 years ago. My son hasn't spoken to me since my last deployment. Whatever leverage the people who controlled my silence once had is gone now. I want to make something very clear before anyone dismisses what follows. I am not religious. I wasn't raised in church. I didn't grow up reading scripture or searching for meaning in the sky. My belief system was built on training, verification, and repeatable results. If something couldn't be tested or measured, it wasn't useful to me. That mindset is the only reason I survived the work I did. It's also the reason what I'm about to describe shattered me in ways I still don't fully understand. In 1989, I was recruited into a compartmentalized task group operating out of Nevada. On paper, I was reassigned to a logistics evaluation unit. In reality, I was transferred to a facility buried beneath a stretch of desert that most people know by a name the government has spent decades trying to deflect attention from. Area 51 isn't a myth, but it also isn't what movies make it out to be. It's not a single base. It's a network, layered both physically and bureaucratically, designed so that no one person ever sees the whole structure. My role wasn't scientific. I wasn't there to analyze data or run experiments. I was there to manage containment operations, personnel movement, and security protocols around assets that could not be allowed to fail. That word asset gets used a lot in classified environments because it strips things of moral weight. People become assets. Information becomes assets. Eventually, truths become assets too. The first year was uneventful by Black Ops standards. Long hours, redundant checks, endless briefings that told you just enough to do your job and nothing more. I learned quickly that curiosity was a liability. The people who asked questions didn't last. They were reassigned, removed, or quietly broken. Survival depended on discipline and restraint. Everything changed in late 1993. I was called into a briefing room I'd never used before, escorted by 2 men I didn't recognize and who didn't introduce themselves. The room was smaller than the others, with walls that absorbed sound in a way that made your own breathing feel intrusive. There were no insignia, no flags, no clocks. Just a table, a chair, and a thin black folder placed precisely at the center. The man who spoke identified himself only as a director. He didn't sit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply told me that I had been selected for a role expansion based on my psychological profile, my lack of religious affiliation, and what he called my cognitive resilience. If I declined, I would be reassigned, and this conversation would never have occurred. If I accepted, my life would narrow permanently. I accepted, not because I was brave, but because declining in environments like that is rarely as clean as they make it sound. The documents I signed that day went far beyond standard non-disclosure agreements. They outlined contingencies that extended to family members, future relationships, and post-service life. They didn't say what would happen if I talked. They described what would be protected if I didn't. The implication was clear. Silence was framed as responsibility, not fear. Within 48 hours, I was transferred to a deeper sector of the facility. Access required biometric verification, rotating passcodes, and escorts who changed every shift so no familiarity could develop. The elevators descended longer than physics should have allowed. At a certain point, you stopped counting floors and started measuring distance in time. The environment down there felt different. Not threatening, not dramatic. Just wrong in a way that made your instincts itch. The air was filtered differently. The lighting lacked a natural spectrum. Sound behaved strangely, flattening footsteps and swallowing echoes. Every surface felt intentional. That was where I first became aware of the asset. It wasn't introduced to us all at once. That would have been destabilizing. Instead, information was layered carefully. First, we were told that the asset was non-human. Then that it was non-biological in ways that challenged classification. Then that it had been in containment longer than most of the personnel working there had been alive. Each revelation was separated by weeks, sometimes months, allowing the mind to adjust just enough to function. The day I saw it for the first time, there were no alarms, no dramatic reveals. I was escorted into an observation chamber and instructed to stand behind a reinforced glass barrier. The room beyond it was large, circular, and lit from above by a diffuse white glow that cast no shadows. At the center of the chamber was a structure that defied easy description. Not a body, not a machine. Something suspended, self-contained, and impossibly still. I didn't feel fear. I felt recognition, though I had no framework for why. The director stood beside me and said something I will never forget. He said, "What you're looking at is not an alien in the way people imagine. It's an intelligence that predates human symbolic thought, and it knows us better than we know ourselves." At that point, I still believed this was about extraterrestrials, advanced life, technology, the usual narratives. I had no idea that the real reason I'd been brought there had nothing to do with space. It had everything to do with God. The asset did not speak. It did not move. But standing there, separated by layers of containment and protocols designed by the smartest people our species could assemble, I felt something press against my awareness. Not a voice, not a command. A question. It wasn't asking who I was. It was asking what I believed. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have an answer. After that first exposure, nothing in my routine remained untouched. I wasn't debriefed immediately, and that omission was deliberate. Shock creates noise. They wanted observation, not reaction. For several days, my schedule remained unchanged on paper, but my access privileges quietly expanded. Doors that had once denied me now opened without hesitation. Corridors I'd never been cleared for appeared on my route listings. The facility had decided I was ready, whether I felt prepared or not. Sleep became irregular, not because of fear, but because of intrusion. I would wake in the middle of the night with the sensation that something had just withdrawn its attention from me, like a pressure change you only notice after it passes. Medical evaluations showed nothing abnormal. Heart rate stable. Cortisol elevated, but within acceptable parameters. Psychological notes described me as contained. That word again. Containment wasn't just for the asset. It applied to people too. The deeper sector of the facility operated on a different rhythm. Personnel spoke less. Movements were efficient, almost ritualized. Everyone understood that mistakes here were not learning opportunities. They were endpoints. The asset dictated that culture without issuing a single directive. Its presence compressed human behavior into narrower, safer channels. I was brought into additional observation sessions, each one closer, each one removing another layer of abstraction. At first, I remained behind reinforced barriers, separated by materials whose composition I was never briefed on. Later, the barriers were reduced to distance alone. The room never changed, circular, light without source. Silence that felt curated rather than empty. The entity itself resisted categorization. It had no clear edges, no symmetry that suggested anatomy. It existed as a stable configuration of matter and energy, suspended in a way that ignored gravity without visibly counteracting it. Instruments registered activity across spectra we didn't have language for, fluctuations that correlated with proximity and attention. When personnel entered the chamber, the readings shifted. When they left, the system returned to baseline. Cause and effect were obvious. Mechanism was not. Scientists avoided anthropomorphic language, but the effort felt strained. They spoke in terms of fields, coherence, resonance. Privately, many admitted that those words were placeholders, not explanations. The asset was responsive. Not reactive, not emotional, but aware. It noticed observation. It noticed intent. That alone placed it beyond any framework humanity was comfortable with. My role evolved from security oversight to interface facilitation. Not communication, they were careful to emphasize. Interaction. The distinction mattered. Communication implies exchange between equals. Interaction allows for asymmetry. They wanted someone present who would not impose narrative or expectation, someone whose internal landscape was comparatively quiet. My lack of religious conditioning had flagged me as suitable. The first intentional interaction occurred without ceremony. I was instructed to enter the chamber alone and remain stationary at a designated point. No equipment, no recording devices. No observers visible, though I knew they were watching from elsewhere. The director's instructions were simple. Do not speak. Do not pray. Do not attempt to define the experience. Just remain. As I stepped into the chamber, the sensation returned immediately. Pressure, not physical, but cognitive. Like standing too close to a powerful transmitter. My thoughts slowed, not from suppression, but from crowding. It felt as though my awareness was being scanned, not invasively, but thoroughly. There was no sense of threat, only assessment. Images surfaced unbidden. Not memories, but constructs. Symbols arranged in ways that triggered recognition without context. Circles intersecting lines. Spirals collapsing into points. Patterns I would later recognize in religious iconography, though at the time they meant nothing to me. I felt them more than saw them, impressions forming and dissolving faster than language could track. Time behaved strangely. I couldn't tell how long I stood there. When the pressure eased, it did so gradually, like a tide receding. I was escorted out without comment. Medical staff recorded my vitals. Psych Evalu noted elevated theta activity, unusual coherence across neural regions. They seemed excited by that. I was unsettled. That night, I dreamed for the first time since childhood. Not images, but narratives that unfolded without characters. Creation without agency. Order emerging from constraints rather than intent. I woke with a headache and a sense of grief I couldn't explain. The medical staff attributed it to stress. They were wrong. Over the following weeks, the interactions continued, each one calibrated carefully. Exposure times increased. Distance decreased. The entity never moved, yet its influence expanded. Personnel began reporting similar dreams, similar sensations, though none were as pronounced as mine. I became the reference point, the control variable. That role isolated me more effectively than any security protocol could have. Eventually, the director authorized a shift in approach. The asset, he explained, had reached what they called a readiness threshold. It was prepared to convey structured information, not through language, but through conceptual transfer. The risk assessment was extensive. Psychological damage, identity destabilization, existential collapse. The conclusion was unanimous. Proceed. I was briefed extensively beforehand, though none of it prepared me. They explained that the entity did not experience reality sequentially. It perceived causality as a field rather than a chain. Human concepts like time, intention, and divinity were, to it, approximations. When it interacted with us, it had to compress its understanding into forms our minds could survive. The next session took place in a modified chamber. Environmental controls were adjusted. Lighting softened further. Acoustic dampening increased. I was instructed to sit this time, to anchor my body and reduce the likelihood of dissociation. The director stood behind the glass, his expression unreadable. As the interaction began, the pressure intensified far beyond previous sessions. My thoughts fragmented, then reassembled around a singular focus. The entity was no longer scanning. It was projecting. What followed was not a message. It was an unveiling. I experienced the emergence of symbolic thought in early humans, not as a historical narrative, but as an internal necessity. The need to ascribe agency to phenomena beyond comprehension. Storms, earth, death, consciousness itself. The entity showed me how belief arose not from revelation, but from pattern recognition under uncertainty. God was not introduced to humanity. God was inferred. A concept expanded. I saw how certain individuals, neurologically predisposed to heightened coherence, became focal points for shared belief. Prophets, mystics, visionaries. Not chosen in a divine sense, but compatible. Their experiences were real. Their interpretations were limited. Over time, structures formed around those interpretations. Religions solidified. Power attached itself to narrative. The entity did not dismiss belief. It contextualized it. I felt my internal framework strain, then fail. The idea of God as an external creator gave way to God as an emergent construct, shaped by contact with an intelligence humanity could not directly comprehend, not a lie, not a trick. An approximation that allowed early minds to integrate overwhelming experiences without breaking. When the pressure finally eased, I was on the floor. Medical personnel rushed in. I was conscious, but altered. The director watched silently as they stabilized me. Later, he would tell me that what I had experienced was unprecedented in clarity. The entity had never projected so deeply before. Recovery took weeks. I was monitored constantly, evaluated daily. My beliefs, such as they were, had collapsed entirely, replaced by a void that was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. I no longer felt the need for answers in the way I once had. That frightened the people in charge more than any breakdown would have. The director visited me once during recovery. He told me that what the entity had revealed could not be disseminated, not because it was false, but because it was destabilizing. Societies require shared myths. Removing them abruptly invites chaos. The asset understood this. It had not intended harm. It had intended correction. Correction, I realized, is often indistinguishable from destruction when you're on the receiving end. As I was cleared to return to limited duty, I understood something with chilling clarity. Area 51 was not about hiding aliens. It was about managing belief, about controlling the narrative that holds civilizations together. The entity was not our prisoner. It was our mirror, reflecting truths we weren't ready to face. And I had seen too much to ever return to ignorance. They didn't rush the next phase. After what the entity had transmitted, urgency would have been a mistake. Minds fracture when pushed too fast, and fractured minds become liabilities. Instead, they surrounded me with routine. Familiar corridors, familiar checklists. The illusion of normality returned just long enough for my nervous system to stabilize. But the content of my thoughts had permanently changed. I could feel it in the way concepts assembled themselves, less like conclusions and more like alignments snapping into place. The director called it cognitive reorientation. I knew better. It was grief. Grief for a worldview that had died without ceremony. When the next contact occurred, it was not framed as an experiment. It was framed as a continuation. I was escorted back into the chamber without formal briefing, without warnings, without preparatory language. The assumption was that I already understood the risks. I did. Understanding didn't make them smaller. This time, the entity did not wait for proximity. The moment I crossed the threshold, the pressure returned, but it was different. More precise, less exploratory. It felt as though it had learned the contours of my cognition and was adjusting itself accordingly. Where earlier interactions had overwhelmed me, this one guided. What it shared was not information in the human sense. There were no facts to memorize, no sequences to reconstruct later. Instead, it imparted perspective, a reframing so fundamental that resistance felt meaningless. I became aware of humanity not as a species progressing through history, but as a pattern emerging from constraints. Biology, environment, and cognition interacting until self-awareness crystallized. Consciousness was not gifted. It was inevitable given sufficient complexity. The entity did not elevate us for achieving it. To them, we were one iteration among many. Then it showed me divergence. Other intelligent systems had arisen elsewhere, on other worlds, under other conditions. Some expanded outward. Some collapsed inward. Some annihilated themselves. Some stabilized. The entity's kind had chosen stabilization long before Earth formed its first multicellular life. They learned early that unchecked expansion leads to extinction. Survival favored restraint, observation, patience, measured in geological time. Humanity, by contrast, was young, volatile, and creative, dangerous but promising. The entity had not arrived on Earth as an invader or savior. It had been here when the planet was still hostile to surface life, adapting alongside the earliest systems capable of supporting awareness. Earth was not chosen. It was shared. Then came the part that still tightens my chest when I think about it. The entity showed me the origin of what humans call God, not as a singular event, but as an interface phenomenon. Early humans, encountering its presence indirectly through altered states, environmental anomalies, and internal resonance, lacked the conceptual tools to understand what they were sensing. Their minds filled the gap with agency. The unknown became intentional. The incomprehensible became divine. This was not manipulation. It was misinterpretation. The entity had not spoken to prophets. It had not issued commandments. It had not demanded worship. But its proximity, its influence on neural coherence, had produced experiences that humans interpreted through the only framework available to them: awe, fear, reverence. Over time, stories formed, symbols, rituals, entire belief systems layered atop an initial misunderstanding. The entity did not deny the emotional reality of faith. It acknowledged its psychological necessity. Belief stabilized early societies. It provided moral scaffolding where none existed. In that sense, God was real, not as an external creator, but as a functional construct born from contact between limited minds and overwhelming intelligence. That realization shattered something inside me. I had always assumed that religion was either true or false, divine revelation or human fiction. The entity dissolved that binary completely. Faith was neither lie nor truth. It was adaptation, a coping mechanism that allowed fragile minds to coexist with forces they could not yet comprehend. The implications were devastating. If God was an emergent concept rather than an absolute being, then every holy war, every persecution, every act of devotion built on exclusive certainty had been fueled by a misunderstanding layered upon itself for thousands of years. The entity showed me how institutions had solidified around belief, how power had attached itself to narrative, how questioning had become heresy not because it was wrong, but because it threatened cohesion. The most disturbing part was what came next. The entity showed me that it had withdrawn deliberately over time. As humanity's cognitive capacity increased, continued proximity risked destabilization. Direct contact would collapse belief systems faster than societies could adapt. So it receded, reducing its influence to background levels. Faith became self-sustaining. God no longer required stimulus. Revelation ended not because humanity was abandoned, but because it was no longer necessary. I felt anger then, sharp and uncontrollable. Billions of people had lived and died believing in something that was never what they thought it was. Entire civilizations had been shaped by that belief. I wanted to accuse the entity of negligence, of cruelty through silence. The response I received was not defensive. It was sorrow. The entity conveyed that intervention beyond a certain threshold causes more harm than absence. When intelligence removes uncertainty prematurely, it destroys the adaptive processes that allow societies to evolve. Humanity had not been ready to know. It might still not be. When the session ended, I was trembling. My body reacted before my mind could. I vomited on the chamber floor. Medical teams rushed in, but I waved them away, needing a moment of stillness to process what I had just been given. Over the next months, I was subjected to relentless evaluation. Psychiatrists tested for dissociation, delusion, nihilism. The results frustrated them. I was stable, or at least functional. But my internal reference points had shifted so profoundly that standard metrics failed to capture it. The director eventually told me the truth they had been circling. The entity had identified me as a viable long-term interface candidate, someone capable of receiving high-density conceptual transfer without catastrophic breakdown. That designation came with consequences. I would not be allowed to leave the program. I would not be allowed to fully disengage. My life would narrow further. Others were not as fortunate. Several personnel involved in earlier phases suffered severe psychological collapse. One became convinced he was a prophet and attempted to preach to other staff. He was removed permanently. Another lost all emotional affect and had to be institutionalized. A third took his own life within weeks of exposure. These outcomes were classified as unrelated incidents. They were not. I began to understand why secrecy was enforced so ruthlessly. This knowledge did not liberate. It destabilized. It stripped away comforting absolutes without immediately replacing them with anything livable. Societies require myths to function. Remove them too quickly, and what remains is not enlightenment, but fragmentation. At one point, I asked the director why they continued the program at all. Why risk so much to interface with something that undermined the very foundations of civilization? He answered honestly, because the entity was not static. Human activity was altering the planet in ways that affected its environment. Nuclear testing, electromagnetic saturation, climate shifts. The entity's patience had limits. Understanding its perspective was not optional. It was survival. The entity had not come to judge humanity. It had come to warn it, indirectly, that the window for ignorant expansion was closing. Whether humanity adapted would determine whether coexistence continued. That was when I realized the final horror. God had not been a lie. God had been a placeholder. And placeholders eventually get replaced when the real thing becomes impossible to ignore. I left the chamber that day, knowing that the greatest threat to humanity was not alien invasion or divine punishment. It was the collapse of meaning that would follow when people realized the stories they built their lives around were approximations, not absolutes. The entity understood that collapse intimately. It had survived one, and it was watching to see whether we would survive ours. After the third phase of contact, the program stopped pretending it was exploratory. Whatever ambiguity had existed was gone. The entity had delivered what it was willing to deliver, and what it revealed had crossed a threshold the people in charge could not ignore. The priority shifted from understanding to containment, not of the entity, but of the consequences. I was reassigned officially to a supervisory role, though the title was meaningless. My function became observational and advisory, a human buffer between the entity and a system struggling to justify its own authority. Every recommendation I made was logged, evaluated, and often overridden, but the act of consulting me served a purpose. It allowed decision-makers to tell themselves they were still in control. Security tightened across the facility. Access corridors were sealed or rerouted. Entire sections were shut down under the justification of structural upgrades. Personnel lists shrank. Familiar faces disappeared from rotation without explanation. The deeper you were embedded, the fewer questions you asked. Survival depended on accepting that absence was part of the architecture. The psychological toll across staff became impossible to hide. Even those without direct exposure showed signs of strain. Sleep disorders increased. Substance use spiked quietly. Marriages failed. The asset exerted influence simply by existing, a gravitational effect on belief structures no containment protocol could fully mitigate. One of the scientists, a man who had spent his career reducing reality to equations, suffered a complete ideological collapse. He cornered me in a corridor one night, eyes wide, voice trembling, and asked me whether morality still mattered if God wasn't what we thought it was. I didn't have an answer. 2 weeks later, he was gone, officially reassigned. Unofficially, removed before the question spread. The first death was labeled an accident. A fall from a maintenance platform. Equipment failure. OSH, a paperwork filed and archived. The second was a heart attack in a man with no prior cardiac history. The third was a suicide, though no note was found, and no one remembered him showing signs of despair. Each incident was isolated. Each was rationalized. Together, they formed a quiet culling. The director never acknowledged it directly, but I saw the calculation behind his eyes. Knowledge like this did not distribute evenly. Some minds bent, some broke. The program was refining itself by attrition, retaining only those who could function without destabilizing the structure. Outside forces became involved soon after. Representatives from intelligence agencies I never interacted with began appearing at briefings. Their questions were different, less technical, more concerned with narrative impact. I recognized the shift immediately. The problem was no longer scientific. It was cultural. At one closed-door meeting, the director admitted what everyone already knew. If the entity's revelations became public, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not because people couldn't handle the truth, but because institutions built on sacred certainty would collapse overnight. Governments derived legitimacy from shared belief systems. Religions anchored moral frameworks for billions. Undermine those foundations too quickly, and chaos would follow. It wasn't about protecting faith. It was about preventing fragmentation. That was when the Vatican entered the conversation. They never came in person, not directly. Communication was routed through intermediaries, diplomats fluent in both theology and secrecy. Their interest was not defensive. It was analytical. They had encountered anomalies for centuries, visions and experiences that never quite fit doctrine. The entity's existence provided a context they could no longer ignore. What surprised me was their restraint. There was no outrage, no denial, only a quiet acknowledgement that theology had always adapted to revelation, even when revelation arrived indirectly. Their concern mirrored the director's. Timing. Humanity was not ready. Other religious authorities were consulted in similar fashion, though none officially. The consensus was unspoken but clear. Faith could evolve, but only gradually. Abrupt exposure would shatter it beyond repair. The entity was aware of these discussions. It did not object. It understood the fragility of human meaning systems better than we did. It had seen civilizations collapse when foundational narratives dissolved too quickly. Its warning was not a threat. It was an observation. As years passed, my role became increasingly ceremonial. I attended meetings, reviewed reports, offered perspective that rarely altered outcomes. The program continued, but with reduced interaction. The entity withdrew further, limiting its influence to passive observation. Whether this was concession or preparation, no one knew. What I did know was that the cost of silence was compounding. I watched the world outside accelerate toward instability, climate crisis, political polarization, technological saturation, faith eroding at the margins, even without disclosure. The stories that had once held societies together were already fraying. The entity's revelations would not cause collapse. They would accelerate one already underway. I raised this concern more than once. Each time, it was acknowledged and deferred. Bureaucracies excel at delay. Delay feels like control. My personal life deteriorated quietly. I became distant, detached. Relationships failed because I could not invest in narratives I knew were incomplete. Friends spoke of purpose and destiny, and I nodded along, aware that those concepts were scaffolding rather than structure. Loneliness became a constant companion, not from isolation, but from perspective. The director retired abruptly 1 year, replaced by someone younger, sharper, less burdened by history. The transition marked a subtle change in tone. Where the director had been cautious, his successor was pragmatic. Risk tolerance increased. So did enforcement. Monitoring intensified. Communications logged. Travel restricted. I was reminded explicitly of the agreements I'd signed decades earlier. Family details surfaced casually in conversation. Not threats, reminders. Silence was still expected. Then came the health issues. At first, I ignored them. Fatigue, weight loss, pain I attributed to stress. When the diagnosis arrived, it landed without drama. Stage 4. Limited options. Probabilities again. The same language that strips meaning from outcome. Something shifted then. Mortality clarifies in ways ideology cannot. The cost-benefit analysis that had governed my silence collapsed under the certainty of my own ending. I realized that containment had an expiration date, and it was no longer aligned with my lifespan. I began documenting what I could, discreetly. Not data, context, patterns, institutional behaviors. I didn't steal files or copy classified material. That would have been reckless. Instead, I preserved understanding, enough to allow others to see the shape of what had been hidden without exposing details that could be misused. I also began noticing changes in the entity's behavior, subtle but consistent. Environmental readings fluctuated more frequently. Neural coherence effects extended farther into the facility. It was responding to something, either internally or externally. Whether that something was humanity's trajectory or its own constraints, I couldn't tell. One final meeting with the program's leadership confirmed what I already suspected. The agreement, whatever form it had taken, was under strain. Human activity was altering the planet faster than predicted. The entity's patience, while vast, was not infinite. Adaptation was required on both sides. They asked me then, directly, whether I believed humanity could adjust its belief systems gradually enough to avoid collapse. I answered honestly, I didn't know. Belief is not a switch. It is a structure built over generations. Removing its load-bearing elements without collapse requires intention, education, humility, none of which humanity had demonstrated at scale. That uncertainty sealed my fate more than any defiance would have. I was quietly sidelined after that. Reduced access, increased observation. They sensed the shift in me, the diminishing leverage. Dying men become unpredictable. I spent my final years watching the world inch closer to truths it wasn't prepared to integrate. Scientific discoveries, rushing against metaphysical questions. AI challenging concepts of consciousness. Faith losing ground without replacement. The placeholder weakening. The entity had survived its collapse by choosing restraint. Whether humanity would do the same remained an open question. And I knew then that silence was no longer neutral. It was complicity. I didn't come to this decision quickly. For a long time, I believed silence was the least harmful option available. That belief was reinforced by systems designed to reward compliance and punish deviation. But it also appealed to my own instinct for control. Silence felt responsible. It felt disciplined. It felt like service. What I failed to understand for years was that silence does not preserve truth. It only delays confrontation with it. As my health declined, the illusion that I could simply outlast the consequences fell apart. The people who had monitored me grew less careful. Check-ins became procedural. Conversations lost their edge. I was no longer an asset worth managing closely. That neglect gave me clarity. When the guardians stop watching, the burden of choice returns fully to the individual. I've had time to reflect on what the entity revealed and what humanity has done in the decades since. We have continued to behave as though meaning is something we can manufacture indefinitely without consequence. We dismantle belief systems without replacing them. We accelerate technology faster than ethics can follow. We mistake access to information for wisdom. In that sense, the entity's warning was not about God at all. It was about maturity. The origin of God, as it was shown to me, was never meant to invalidate faith. It was meant to contextualize it. God was humanity's first interface with the incomprehensible, a way to survive contact with forces far beyond our cognitive limits. That interface worked. It stabilized societies long enough for them to grow. The tragedy is that we mistook the interface for the source. When you worship the symbol and forget its purpose, rigidity replaces adaptation. That is where danger begins. I think often about how many people would hear this and feel threatened, not because their beliefs are wrong, but because their identity is bound to them. Faith is not just doctrine. It is community, memory, comfort, and hope. To pull that away abruptly would be cruel. The people who have guarded this secret understand that. That is why suppression was chosen over revelation, not out of malice, but out of fear of collapse. But suppression has its own cost. Belief systems erode naturally over time. Science, exposure, and cultural exchange weaken absolutism, whether governments intervene or not. What replaces belief, when no alternative framework is offered, is fragmentation. People grasp for meaning wherever they can find it. Conspiracies, extremism, artificial identities. The placeholder weakens, and nothing steps in to stabilize the structure. The entity recognized this trajectory long before we did. Its withdrawal was not abandonment. It was restraint. It allowed humanity space to develop without constant external influence. But restraint does not mean indifference. The entity continues to observe, not to judge, but to assess. The question it is asking is not whether we are intelligent. It is whether we are capable of outgrowing the stories that once protected us. The answer remains uncertain. I am often asked, hypothetically, what would happen if the truth became public, if undeniable evidence emerged, if the placeholder collapsed overnight? My answer is always the same. Nothing would end immediately. There would be no divine retribution, no alien invasion, no singular moment of reckoning. What would happen instead is slower and more dangerous. Meaning would fracture unevenly. Some would adapt, some would radicalize. Some would retreat entirely. Institutions would scramble to reassert relevance. Power would concentrate around new narratives, not necessarily better ones. Chaos does not arrive with noise. It arrives with confusion. The people who kept this secret believed they were preventing that outcome. They may have delayed it. They did not prevent it. Humanity is already approaching a point where the old narratives no longer hold and no shared alternative exists. The entity's revelation did not create that instability. It simply illuminated it. I am not naive enough to believe this testimony will change the world. Most will dismiss it. Some will ridicule it. Others will twist it to serve agendas I cannot control. That is unavoidable. Truth, once released, no longer belongs to the person who speaks it. It becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever the viewer brings to it. What I hope, quietly, is that a small number of people will recognize something familiar in this account. Not the specifics, the pattern. The sense that humanity has been mistaking scaffolding for structure. That we have been worshiping our own coping mechanisms without asking whether they still serve us. To those who hold faith dear, I say this with sincerity. Your experiences are not invalid. The comfort you draw from belief is real. The moral frameworks built around it have done immense good. Nothing the entity showed me diminishes that. What it challenges is exclusivity, not meaning. The idea that truth must be singular, static, and final. Growth does not require abandonment. It requires flexibility. To those who reject faith entirely, I offer equal caution. Stripping away belief without offering coherence is not enlightenment. It is negligence. Humans need meaning the way they need oxygen. Remove it abruptly, and they will suffocate. Rationality alone cannot carry the weight of existence. The entity understood this balance. That is why it did not reveal itself openly. That is why it did not correct our interpretations sooner. It allowed humanity to develop its own symbolic systems, because those systems were necessary at the time. The tragedy is not that God was misunderstood. The tragedy is that we stopped updating our understanding when circumstances changed. If the truth comes out fully, and it will eventually, the choice humanity faces will not be whether to believe or not. It will be whether to adapt responsibly or fracture under the weight of lost certainty. The entity will not force that decision. It has seen the outcome of coercion. It will simply withdraw further if adaptation fails. Some interpret that as abandonment. It is not. It is consequence. As for me, my role in this story is nearly over. I have lived long enough to see the cost of silence and the risk of speech. I have chosen speech not because it is safe, but because it is necessary. Silence preserved stability for a time. It now preserves stagnation. I do not expect absolution. I am complicit in a system that valued control over transparency. I accepted that bargain for decades. This testimony does not erase that. It simply ends my participation in it. To my son, if you ever read this, know that my distance was never a lack of love. It was fear and duty misunderstood. I hope understanding this brings you peace rather than anger. To those who worked alongside me and chose to remain silent, I do not judge you. You did what you believed was right under impossible circumstances. The weight we carried was never meant for individuals. It was a burden no system should have assigned in the first place. And to whatever intelligence continues to observe us, know that some of us are trying to grow past the need for placeholders. We are flawed, impulsive, and often cruel, but we are also capable of reflection. Whether that capacity matures in time remains to be seen. The origin of God was never a lie. It was a beginning, a bridge between ignorance and understanding. Bridges are not destinations. They are meant to be crossed. My name is Thomas High. I served in operations that do not officially exist. I kept a secret that shaped civilizations. At the end of my life, I choose to release it not to destroy meaning, but to make room for something more honest. What humanity does next will determine whether we remain a species defined by fear of the unknown, or one capable of meeting it without collapsing. The entity is watching, not with judgment, with patience. And patience, I have learned, is not infinite.